basically I argued for a capital grant system, and that would be a good tool to stabilize the economy going forward. But those are sort of the 4 or 5 aspects that I feel are very important. All of these are not simple. They require major reforms and major adjustments of people. But I think overall it would benefit China a lot. It would create a better environment for growth, less wasteful growth. So the central government would need to take on that role much more forcefully. They can, because central government still has a very limited amount of debt. It's less than 25% of GDP, which is very limited.
Good morning, Mr. Hofman. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our interview today is about the 20th Central Committee of the CPC, which started its third plenary session in Beijing on Monday morning. And the fiscal policy is a very important item on this agenda. And I have read your article. You mentioned that fiscal policies are critical for more shared growth. So in the first half of this year, China has made many adjustments in the fiscal policy. So my question is, what is your overall evaluation for these fiscal adjustments?
All right, I think there's 3 important aspects of fiscal policy that would need to be addressed. One is the distribution of income. And that would require a more equalizing tax structure. Currently, China is raising revenues predominantly through the value-added tax and the consumption tax, and to some extent the enterprise income tax. Personal income taxes doesn't play much of a role, and that's largely because very few people actually pay them. Most people are exempt. But as people get richer, that's no longer normal, and you would want to see a bit more redistribution, a bit more contribution to the government and to public services from the richer people compared to the poorer people. Second, it's important to get the money where it is needed. And at the moment, where it is particularly needed is local governments. Local governments do most of the spending in China. They get money from the central government through transfers, and they have part of shared taxes. But a big part of the revenues was, and I now talk in past tense, was income from selling land leases to property developers. Because of the difficulties in the property sector, that's no longer a sustainable source of revenues. So local governments need to get different sources of revenues, and that requires a major readjustment of the intergovernmental fiscal relationships. The third aspect is simply money. Government needs to raise more money. There's lots of needs. There's lots of needs in the rural areas, in the urban areas. In future, because of the aging of the population, increased health spending, increased pension spending, lots of unfulfilled needs still that only the government can supply. So that third aspect simply requires China to raise more money. The personal income tax that I mentioned is one, but phasing out some of the tax deductions that have been granted over the COVID crisis is a second one. A third would be taxing more items that are principally bad, such as carbon emissions. A carbon tax would be a really good idea for China. A fourth revenue source that few people talk about, but I think is going to be very important, is dividends from state enterprises. So that can be a lot more. And that would then provide the revenues that China's government can use to do better spending, better education, more healthcare, a future pension system. It can solve a lot of the problems that are currently ahead. There's a fifth aspect of fiscal policy, but that's a bit more complex, And that is the overall function of fiscal policy as a macroeconomic stabilization tool. And really, what China has been doing over the past 15, 20 years is to use local governments for stabilization. If the economy was bad, local governments were allowed to borrow more, were allowed to spend more, and that sort of stabilized the economy, it stabilized employment, it stabilized growth. With the situation of local finances as they are, that's no longer possible. So the central government would need to take on that role much more forcefully. They can, because central government still has a very limited amount of debt. It's less than 25% of GDP, which is very limited. But China can create channels by which the central government can finance macroeconomic stabilization. And basically, I argued for a capital grant system, and that would be a good tool to stabilize the economy going forward. So those are sort of the 4 or 5 aspects that I feel are very important. All of these are not simple. They require major reforms and major adjustments of people. But I think overall it would benefit China a lot. It would create a better environment for growth, less wasteful growth, and a more equal access to services and a more equal income distribution.
And I think in your article, you have proposing opinion about sharing of VAT, the rare added tax based on actual consumption. So could you share a little bit more about this strategy?
Yeah, now first we have to be clear that I'm not talking about the consumption tax as it is in China, which really is an excise tax, as we would call it internationally. It is on taxing bads. Okay, it's like fuel, like smoking, like alcohol. Those are luxury goods. They all have a consumption tax on them. So I'm talking about largely about the value-added tax, which should be a tax on consumption. But the way China collects that tax and redistributes the tax shares, because local governments share in the value-added tax, that basically makes it a production tax. And because local governments, because they get back half of the VAT that is paid on their enterprises, from which the VAT is collected. They love to attract enterprises, even if they're not profitable, even if they are loss-making, even if these companies should move somewhere else and would do better. But local governments love to hold on to that because they get VAT revenues on it. If you were to say, well, look, it is really a tax on consumption. In the end, it's consumers that pay the VAT to companies who then pay to the government. You should actually redistribute that VAT on the basis of consumption. And then you get a very different incentive. And one can do that. First of all, the National Bureau of Statistics now also has provincial level national accounts that are pretty reliable. So you can actually distribute according to how much consumption does a province have, and that's the share in the VAT that they get. And sub-provincial, you can probably work with retail sales as an indicator. If the government were to say, the central government were to say, look, we're going to have a different system of distributing the local share of value-added tax, you get very different incentives. So if you were to do it based on consumption, suddenly local governments start caring about consumption, and they start caring about, okay, what would actually stimulate consumption rather than what stimulate production, as is baked in the current system. As I wrote, Japan has that system. There's an alternative way of thinking about it. They say, well, really that national tax, it should be distributed equally. So each and every province gets an equal share of the value-added tax collected by the central government based on their population. That's what Germany does. And that actually is very equalizing because it's such a big chunk. It's such a big chunk of tax revenues in China. It would equalize the fiscal capacity among localities much more than the current system of derivation-based sharing. And that would help poorer governments to provide an equal level of services compared to richer governments. And that's really the objective of the government, to equalize services delivery across China. So I think it would be a major reform, but you can introduce it gradually. I think it would be very helpful for China. It would majorly improve the equalization of service delivery, and it would give better incentives for local governments. So to not just be focused on production, even if it's not profitable, but to also think about consumption and people's welfare.
I want to talk something more about the relationship between the central and local governments in China, because right now especially the local fiscal is facing a lot of difficulties. They are not easy. So how should this be addressed?
There's a couple of ways, and one I already mentioned, but if you reverse the measures taken during the COVID crisis, there was a lot of tax credits being given, a lot of taxes were postponed or temporarily suspended. That had a big impact on local governments. So reversing that would actually help local governments. Second, I mentioned, you can devise new transfer mechanisms. I mentioned the capital grants transfer, which would be one mechanism. Central government could take on more of local government tasks in financing them. A very obvious one would be the pension system. A final one would then be to give local governments more tax base, a tax base of their own. And in China, there's been a lot of discussion on the real estate tax or other taxes. I'm not so sure whether that is actually going to work. Part of the reason is that the real estate sector is now into trouble, and people wouldn't like it if taxes were to be levied and then the prices would go down further. But there are some ways of looking at that. I personally propose to do a real estate tax only on new property so that nobody gets hurt. Only on new property, and then gradually more and more property is being taxed. But there are other taxes that are quite obvious. One proposal that I made is to allow local governments a surcharge on the personal income tax. Because of the goal of common prosperity, it's very logical that the rich should contribute more. If you look further at the revenue sources of local governments, an underestimated one is really utilities. In China, a lot of governments, they don't charge enough for utilities. And that is to promote industry, to attract businesses. They give discounts on utilities. But it's not very good for China as a whole. So you could ask local governments to charge more for utilities. A final one would be motor vehicle taxes or now electric vehicle taxes that can over time, not now, but over time be a good revenue source for local governments. So there's still a lot that local governments can raise in money. So the transfer system has to continue to play a big role. The central provincial distribution is more and more equalizing, but I think a lot of the concerns are below the province. And I think central government should actually take more initiative to ensure that below the province also the distribution of the money between the prefectures and between the counties is as equal as central government wants it to be. Because otherwise you'd still have, even though you do the central provincial, you equalize, but if below that you don't equalize, you still have very large differences in fiscal capacity.
How much room is there for further adjustment to China's fiscal policy in the next half year, and what will be the most important thing?
Fiscal policy that I think is very important, irrespective of whether there's reforms, is to ensure that the impact of the real estate downturn on the banking system remains limited. And I'm saying that because if it is, you can choose. The damage is already done. The housing price has come down. The developers are into trouble and they can't all pay back to the banks. If you leave the problem with the banks, that means that they have less to lend. They can lend less to other parts of society, the growing parts of society. So I believe that it would be sensible for the government to take on some of that old debt, if you want, the non-performing debt, and to give the banks the capability to lend again to new sectors, not to the real estate sector, but to new sectors. For that, you need fiscal resources to fix that. So I think that would be very important for the next 6 months to do. But those reforms that I talk about, I mean, they're long run. They don't need to happen in the next 6 months. They can happen in the next 3 years.